Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 107th episode of the Writ podcast. We're fast approaching the return of Parliament and the beginning of the fall political season. Over the summer, we've seen Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre try to change his image, and the Liberals contend with some souring poll numbers. So this week, I've reconvened the pollster panel, Dan, Andrew, and Andrew Enns. Unfortunately, James Valcke wasn't able to join us. Dan is Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara. He worked as Director of Research and Advertising in the Prime Minister's office, and he polled for the Trudeau Liberals in each of the past three elections. And Andrew is Executive Vice President at Léger, previously polled for the Federal Conservatives during the Harper years, and has polled for provincial Conservative parties across the country. Dan, Andrew, good to have you back.
Great to be back.
Good to be here.
It is the the low days of summer, but there's still lots to talk about. I do want to start with just the general kind of climate we've seen with the polls over the last few weeks, because it has been a pretty rough time, it seems, for the Liberals in terms of the numbers. We've seen some numbers putting anywhere from 5 to 10 points for a lead for the Conservatives. So just as a general question, where do both of you see the public opinion climate right now? Dan, maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, I think it's in some respects not surprising. This is a government that's been around for 8 years, and people start to get a little tired after 8 years, generally speaking, unless you're the Alberta PCs circa 20 years ago, and you can govern forever and ever before that happens. But couple that with the inflationary pressures that are still very real to people. We do some polling at Pollara on inflation, and the majority of Canadians think inflation is going to get worse just because it's down to 3.3% or 2.8% or whatever. People don't feel that. Ground meat's still pretty expensive. Gas is still pretty expensive. Certainly if you're trying to renew your mortgage, it's going to get more expensive. So I think there's a lot of economic angst out there, and it's kind of to be expected. The government's going to wear that to some extent.
Andrew, what do you think where things stand? Are we in the kind of climate that would produce a 7, 8, 10-point lead for the Conservatives?
Well, you still have to get through that campaign to sort of see it to the end. But I certainly agree with Dan that this has been something that, and I think if you go back, it's been slowly building in this direction. I mean, I know we were sort of in an environment for the last couple of years where it was a point or two gap, but then there was a 3 or 4 point gap, and then that was fairly steady lead. And now the last couple of months we've seen it stretch to, which is pretty typically a 7, and as you say, to even for some 10-point lead. I think it's real in the sense that combination, as Dan says, you've got a government that's getting into the 8th year, and not only 8 years, but it's also been a government that's gone through 3 elections with Canadians, and Canadians tend to also look at those elections as those are the events that they really remember because they're right in your face. And so this government's, we've already had 3 of them, which sort of all of a sudden for some people thinks it's like it's been forever now that they've been in power. So it's there, and I will say that unlike Scheer and O'Toole, Poilievre's in a stronger position. He's got his, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in terms of the challenges, but quite frankly, he's got a much more united party than Scheer or O'Toole had. He's I'd say stronger in terms of the communications, and I think that's also paying off a bit. I would say that the Tory vote has crept up a little. This is still largely sort of driven. I think this gap is driven largely by bleeding from the Liberals. But nonetheless, I think it's a bit of a combination of strength and weakness.
Whether the numbers are real or not, it does get people talking, right? And some nervous, as in the nervous Nellies, looking at the poll numbers. So, the question has arisen whether the numbers get bad enough that what has been a pretty solid caucus for Justin Trudeau starts to wonder whether someone else would do any better. Dan, are we at a point where those questions are going to start getting asked?
I mean, there was some grumbling, obviously, after the cabinet shuffle, which is maybe not unexpected. Everybody feels that they should be in cabinet, and there's going to be a lot of people that are disappointed after any shuffle to some extent, and griping about that to anyone who will take their phone calls. But honestly, I feel like this is still a Liberal Party that really remembers what it was like before Justin Trudeau came along. And, this was a party that there were books being written about the death of the Liberal Party, and he kind of brought them back from the dead. So I don't think this is a situation where um, there's going to be any overt calls for Trudeau to leave. We talked about this last time we were on here about kind of the post Alberta election Notley scenario. Same situation there, where Notley just is so instrumental in bringing that party to where it is right now that it's up to her, I think, in terms of when she wants to leave. And I also think, just from Liberals I talk to, there is still, I think, the belief out there, which I share, that Trudeau is somebody who, when it comes to the campaign, he will bring his A game. We've seen him win debates. We've seen him do 5 events a day for a week. We've seen him fire up crowds, bring that energy, and ultimately, that's when elections are win or lost. It's during the Writ period. It's during the campaign. It's not 2 years beforehand, unless you do really bad 2 years beforehand, in which case it becomes very difficult during the campaign. But I think, ultimately, there's still that view out there that Trudeau is the best person to lead the Liberals, and it would be a pretty big crap shot on anybody else at this stage in the game who is untested and who could be, if you brought somebody else in, they would be the victims, I'm sure, of a multi-million-dollar conservative advertising campaign, and who knows where they're standing at the end of that as well too. So everyone I talk to seems to think this is, still Trudeau's campaign, and that he has the ability to pull out a win if he brings his A game in a campaign.
Andrew, because it seems to me that a lot of these questions of people who are wondering whether someone would do better has an ideal leader in mind that may or may not exist, right? Because it's always possible that someone who replaces Justin Trudeau, as many problems as you might have in public opinion right now, could end up doing a lot worse, right? And you just really don't know what's going to happen until you open that box.
No, and I think Dan. I mean, I think the thing that Dan hit, perfectly is the danger of a replacement that exposes a whole entire new set of weaknesses so I think that has to be a caution. I think the decision on the prime minister rests with the prime minister. I mean, what he wants to do. There's going to be some. I'm sure there's lots of evaluation within the Liberal Party. I mean, when you look at the conditions you need to go into an election to win, and for starters, the prime minister's fought 2 elections against arguably weaker conservative leaders and hasn't been able to produce a majority. In fact, has come up short in terms of popular vote on both. So it's difficult to sort of suggest that the fourth election for the prime minister is going to be different. So it's really hard to imagine a majority government if you're in that Liberal caucus. The poll numbers aren't looking good. The governments, they've got a retreat where and they did a cabinet shuffle where they're really trying to retool the whole focus of government to try to turn things around, to connect a bit better with Canadians on the issues that Canadians now, which is very different than 2015 when this government won a majority, that they now have to kind of retool to. And you've got a prime minister personally that's negatives are creeping up and the positives are going down. But I think he's got a strong control in the party. He's got his people in the right places, and it'll be up to him whether he decides if there's, I was talking with Jean-Marc the other day. He reminded me, Trudeau Senior did a world tour and then came back from that and decided to go for his walk in the snow and say, I'm done. So maybe we'll have to keep an eye on Trudeau's travel itinerary and see if he's doing any world tour, and maybe that'll be the tell. But, I really do think it's up to him. And I think he also really wants to, I have a feeling he really wants to go at Pierre Poilievre in a campaign. So that could be motivating as much as anything.
Yeah, we'll see if Justin Trudeau takes another trip to India. That could be the end of everything, I think, for him.
Yeah.
So. Okay, so let's talk about then the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre. So clearly they decided over the summer that they were going to try something different with him. It seems trivial, but, ditching the glasses, ditching the suits. So clearly this was a deliberate attempt. We've seen it before with past leaders doing that before. And it is designed to try to change people's perception of a leader. But then we also saw the ads. There was 3 ads that came out. One was a standard attack ad against the carbon tax. Another was an ad with Pierre Poilievre building a puzzle about how the country's broken, was including one of his children. And then the one that got the most attention was more of an introduction ad voiced by his wife, saying that he was someone who accepted him, loved her, and all this. Andrew, what is this rebrand? What was this ad? What was it trying to achieve?
Well, I think that it's been it has just been, or not even quite a year that he's assumed the leadership of the party. So I think the ad with his wife was really a bit of an introduction. I think it's also an opportunity for the party to try out some of the messaging and take a look at these things. I don't think we're not on a cusp of an election, and there certainly doesn't feel like there's going to be one for lots of talk for the next couple years. The supply agreement seems to be holding quite well, and neither party seems interested in changing. So I think this is an opportunity for the party to start to check to sort of push on a few different areas and see what resonates. They are cognizant that there's a perception and fueled by his critics that he's got rough edges and so he's trying to look at taking some of those off. There's also a need to reach into sort of a broader base of voters. And again, this is an area where they will see how this works and learn from it, through the research that they'll do internally to see how these things, what works and what doesn't. I suspect too that this also addresses probably some demand even within the party, that people were sort of saying that you need to show that different side, and so it checks a few boxes for them. I thought the ads were pretty reasonable efforts in terms of the professionalism and certainly the two that sort of tried to present them in a slightly different light. And I guess time will tell in terms of how they sit and where they end up with voters.
Dan, when Tom Mulcair was leading the NDP and leading in the polls, a joke often made with my friend Aaron Wary was about how we haven't had a bearded prime minister since Alexander Mackenzie. And now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think we've had a prime minister who wore glasses when they were elected. When they eventually get a bit older, they start wearing glasses. Harper did at the end of his tenure. It seems like a stupid thing, and it probably is a stupid thing. But you've been in those kind of focus groups where you're testing image kind of questions. What do you think kind of conversation produced these changes to his image, just the way that he's approaching and presenting himself?
Yeah, I can just imagine the focus groups I'm sure that they've been having on this, where you're like, what kind of animal does Pierre Poilievre remind you of, and does he remind you of an ex-boyfriend or a boss, and just the discussions going around, and I'm sure they are showing the pictures of him with the glasses and without the glasses and comparing their reactions, which is all very interesting. I think it's important because ultimately voters are going to form an impression of a politician that's based on just a gut feel to some extent. Do I trust this person? Do I like this person? And little subconscious things, be it glasses or if you're wearing a tie or not, do make a difference. So I think it's certainly something that the Conservative Party, would have been doing research on. And clearly they have concluded that people don't like glasses. Given he switched over his profile picture after kind of experimenting for the summer, it seems like they've sort of landed on the more casual, no glasses look, which I think does soften him up to some extent. Clearly, these ads soften him up to some extent. If you went into one of those kind of AI tools and said, write me an ad that will soften up a politician's persona, they'd say, yeah, have his wife narrated and have a little kid doing puzzles. And clearly, it's designed to do that. I think they're pretty good to that extent at accomplishing what they set out to do, especially the one with his wife narrating, I think is really good. But ultimately, the ad campaign is one aspect of that. If people are seeing an ad on TV and then they're seeing pictures of Pierre Poilievre on the news with dudes in straight pride t-shirts and ranting about the WEF or whatever, they're going to be left with a bit of cognitive dissonance there. So what I'm really curious on is when the House comes back this fall, are we going to see the same kind of angry, full throttle Pierre Poilievre, or is he going to be a kindler, gentler Pierre Poilievre? So I'll be curious to see if kind of the demeanor he takes matches up with this new, bit more softer image that he's trying to project through the advertising.
Andrew, were there weaknesses they were trying to address with these ads and this rebranding of his image?
I don't know if there were specific weaknesses that they felt they had to address. Even when you look at the polling numbers and some of the Leger polls that we put out, there's a gap with female voters, but it's not massive. So I don't think this was sort of a real deliberate attempt to say, oh, like we're cratering with women and we've got to try to address that. So let's get his wife to address. I think I think there's certain areas that potentially particularly again with the narrated ad could open up in terms of an effort that I think the party still has opportunity to make inroads with is with the new Canadian and immigrant ethnic populations, and I think there's this ad, while not overtly, I think for some they may pick up on that, and it presents an opportunity for them to make a deliberate, not necessarily through more advertising. I just think more on the ground activity and more I think back to the efforts that Jason Kenney took in 2009 to 2011 that very quietly but quite importantly opened up a whole new vote for Prime Minister Harper in 2011. And so that could be opportunities. I wouldn't suggest that was deliberately to shore up a weakness, but there's an opportunity there.
I can't remember the exact line, but paraphrasing, his wife says, as Pierre Poilievre says, doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. So that does seem to be a nod towards that.
It is fair. Like he's got a very interesting backstory, as I'm sure you're both aware of, in terms of his father and his family. And like I think that I personally think that there's an opportunity there for again not having to hit people over the head in terms of an ad, but for people to start to understand and get to know would change a little bit of potentially sort of perspectives and impressions of the individual and his growing up and some of the values that he does share. Which Dan raises a great point that it's all great to put into an ad, but you do have to start to embody that a bit more sort of naturally in many other situations. So I agree. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays for the next couple years.
Dan, I'm curious what your perspective would be as someone who designed or participated in Liberal campaigns. What should the Liberals be doing here? Because everybody has been making the point that it's surprising that we haven't seen an overt advertising campaign against Pierre Poilievre. What is there a reason that the Liberals are doing this beyond they don't have enough money to do it? Which I find hard to believe. You can borrow money when you're a party of government, but why? What's the strategy here, or what should it be?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I teach a course at Carleton in the MPM program on election campaigns, and one of the things we talk about is very much, the value of branding your opponent before they brand themselves, because it's a lot easier to brand someone than it is to rebrand someone. There's actually been a lot of academic literature on this, where you show people a list of arguments in favor of something and a list of arguments against something. You kind of mix the order up, and inevitably, whoever sees the argument first, that's the one that sticks with them, whether or not it's the pro argument or the con argument. So getting that initial branding is quite important, and I think the Conservatives are obviously trying to get Poilievre branded before the Liberals do. And to some extent, maybe you could consider that a failure on the Liberals' parts to not brand him to this extent. That said, I mean, I remember in 2017, Andrew Scheer was running ads where he was walking through a park saying, "Hey guys," and everyone's like, "Hey Andrew," and they spent millions of dollars on that campaign. And it was very much the same thing. Like, I'm middle class. I grew up just like you. I'm not one of these elites. I'm a hardworking uh, family man. It was definitely his brand. They ran a $2 million campaign the next year where Scheer was talking about his vision for the country. So the Conservatives spent many million dollars pre-writ in that election cycle, and inevitably what ended up branding Andrew Scheer was, I think more than anything else, was a video that was posted by Ralph Goodale on Twitter a month before the election campaign of Scheer talking in the House of Commons about gay marriage several years before. And then certainly in the groups we did during that campaign, like that really stuck with people much more than Andrew Scheer walking through the park. They remembered him being the guy who had been saying things that people found quite distasteful on the issue of gay marriage. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that an ad campaign is going to be the thing that brands someone. There are other ways you can get your message out. I mean, the Prime Minister has enough reach that he goes to a movie and tweets it out, and 40 million people see the picture of it, right? So, you don't have to spend money on an ad campaign. Clearly, if the government sticks to a message against Poilievre, be it that he's reckless or risky or doesn't care about you or whatever the message is, and pushes that out, I think they have an opportunity to land that message. And you can make the argument about doing that now versus doing it closer to the election campaign. I think that's obviously a decision that people are weighing out. And I think it's fair to say the government and the Prime Minister have not pulled their punches. I mean, if you look at Trudeau's big speeches at the Liberal convention, he's taken shots at Poilievre. So I think part of that is still going on to some extent here. And I guess we'll see, as Andrew said, if this campaign is one that actually defines Poilievre or if it's something else. And I mean, it's still a while to the next election campaign, so I think there's opportunities still for the Liberals to brand him.
I just jump in, or I mean, like, there's no shortage of articles and media coverage that's putting a different perspective on Pierre Poilievre and his leadership. I mean, I think just this week there was, the whole he's going out, he leads with conspiracy theories and things like that. So, I do think that it's, I think Dan's exactly right that you don't necessarily have to sort of embark on a fairly significant ad campaign, sponsored by the party to still be challenging and challenging whatever the Conservatives are trying to do in terms of their brand efforts. And I would say that in part that's why the Conservatives are probably doing this now, is that they do know that there's a probably largely driven more by a media narrative that they appreciate they need to sort of push back on at least a little bit and see and see how that works. It's again, there's time to sort of look at how these things work and then fine tune it as you get closer to an actual campaign event.
Yeah, and Dan, you mentioned it. We kind of forget, or maybe we just chose to not focus on it, but this introduction ad that we saw from Pierre Poilievre, we did see the exact same thing with Andrew Scheer, and we saw the exact same thing with Aaron O'Toole, and it was focused on his life of service, that kind of thing. So this is not unusual to try to introduce a new leader in that kind of way.
Yeah, I remember Michael Ignatieff sitting in a green forest introducing himself. I mean, everybody does this, right? And sometimes they work, and more often than not, they're kind of forgotten because something bigger comes along that ends up defining people, be it an event or just a something they do that kind of takes over.
Yeah, I had forgotten that Michael Ignatieff ad. Okay, let's move on a little bit. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about before we just started looking ahead to the fall. Was in the by-elections that took place recently in Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan, the governments in both cases campaigned in part against the federal carbon tax. So we saw in Nova Scotia that was one of the biggest issues in the Preston by-election. The PCs were more or less saying that the Liberals are for the federal carbon tax, you should vote for the PCs, and the PCs flipped that riding pretty dramatically. We also saw in Saskatchewan, there wasn't as much success for the Saskatchewan party there. They went after the NDP in particularly one of the Regina ridings, saying that the candidate there had made statements in the past how he was supportive of the federal carbon tax. It didn't work. The NDP was able to win the seat, but it's clear that provincial parties are joining the chorus against the federal carbon pricing, carbon taxing plan. And when you have governments across the country that are primarily conservative, I think you're going to hear this pretty frequently for the next couple of years. So I'm curious what both of you think about just how, first of all, how potent of an issue this is for the Conservatives and how dangerous it is for the Liberals. Andrew, why don't you start us off?
Well, certainly, and just to add to that, I mean, the progressive Conservatives in Manitoba are doing the same ththing. In terms of the Wab Canoe liberal carbon tax. So, and look, the carbon tax is not popular right now, and it goes up. I mean, that's sort of the challenge, I think, for the for the Liberal government, is that it's not it's increasing. There's a formula for it to go up, and it's a very visible tax in the sense of it changes the price of gasoline that we all still use a lot. So so the opposition to it has grown. It it's an interesting if it's discussed within the environment, within the context of climate change and this broader effort, you can take the edge off a little bit in terms of opposition to it. But the way you just described in those by-elections, like it's a tax. They're not talking about sort of putting it in saving the environment, reducing emissions, and things of that nature. And in that sense, it can be pretty effective, and it'll be interesting. Like we haven't talked about other issues, but right now, if affordability continues to run to 2025, I think it'll be a potent issue, and one that could have the Liberal government on the defensive. But I mean, we're also seeing at the same time like dramatic climate events that we would never have imagined, and it's breathtaking. And now we're watching one potentially unfold in Yellowknife, as we sit. So it it and in that sense, I mean, the Liberals were very good at making the carbon tax like really almost the only way you could have a legitimate climate policy was with this. And if you weren't with the carbon tax, you had sort of a fake policy. And I'm actually not a scientist, and I'm not smart enough to understand whether or not you could still have a good climate policy without it. Poilievre and the Conservatives are clearly going to make that effort, I think, in the next election. It'll be interesting to see, what the Liberals do, because it's not popular. It is not, and with provincial governments now piling on, it's amplifying the noise around it and the the negative side of it around it. And there's not many people talking about the supposed upside of it in terms of how it's helping with the environment. It's part of our responsibilities. And by the way, you're getting money back, which I just I've yet to see anybody feel that they're getting their money back, even though I suspect they are, but they just don't feel it.
Dan, is it a dead weight for the Liberals, or like what this issue, as Andrew said, has been effective in the past in terms of contrasting themselves with Conservatives, but it seems like it's balanced over on the other side now.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a risk for the Liberals. I mentioned some of the polling around inflation that we're doing at Pollara. We always ask people how stressed you are about different costs of living expenses too, and cost of food is number one. You've got half of Canadians who say I'm very stressed about the cost of food. Housing's number two at 42% who say they're very stressed, but cost of gas is 38% very stressed, almost on par with housing. And we're hearing a lot about housing these days too, but I mean, gas is right up there as a big cost of living expense for people. In Atlantic Canada, it's even higher. It's close to half people in Atlantic Canada say they're very stressed about the cost of gas. It's ahead of housing there as a cost of living pressure. And I know the carbon tax is newer there as well too, and just kind of coming in, so there's more tension on it. So that could partly explain maybe why it had a bit more impact on the Nova Scotia by-elections as opposed to the Saskatchewan ones. But yeah, anytime that you're dealing with a cost of living pressure cooker out there for the way the public is feeling, if you are seen to be proactively making matters worse, never mind even ideally if you're seen as making things better. If you're seen as making things worse, that's obviously a vulnerability. And maybe in 2 years, cost of living won't be the big issue. Maybe environment will be the big issue given all of these natural climate-driven disasters we're having, in which case being on the other side of the issue could be a big advantage for the Liberals. But I think right now it is certainly a concern. I think they do need to make sure that they get the story out about the rebate, which is, for a family of four in Nova Scotia, it's $1,000 a year that you're getting back in terms of the climate action incentive. So it's not, it's actually meaningful money, and I think there's a way to tell that story. But clearly, if I was working for a conservative government right now, yeah, it's a big juicy target to take a shot at.
Let's move on to, we'll close with just kind of a look ahead to the fall. MPs will be returning at the mid-September, late September, and the fall political season is, the run up to the budget season in the spring, I guess. James isn't here, so we don't have an NDP voice to talk about the NDP. I'll try to take on his role a little bit. Like if I'm looking at what the NDP needs to do, it's still that they still have to push the government on their policy objectives, and at the same time being a party that is opposing the government, which they are doing a lot of in terms of their messaging, decrying the government over housing and lots of other issues. But I'm starting to think that they also need to have a lot more efforts against the Conservatives because the Conservatives doing well in the polls. They're probably in a good position to flip a lot of NDP seats in areas that the NDP lost in the Ontario provincial election. So I think that might be one of the focuses they might have to do over the spring. And there is going to be the Manitoba election, and that'll be a really key one for them. If they can get an NDP government in Manitoba where they have a decent relationship with the provincial party as opposed to the one in Alberta or Saskatchewan, that would be a good news for them. But do either of you, both of you, Dan and then maybe Andrew, just a short kind of comment on what the NDP's objectives should be for the fall?
Yeah, and well, since James isn't here, I'll take a second just to pump their tires a bit. Those Saskatchewan by-elections actually were really good for the provincial NDP there. And I know we talk about the federal government being long in the tooth after 8 years. I mean, that's a government that's been around 16 years,
It's
right?
the new Alberta in
Uh,
Saskatchewan.
and I guess the question will this be year 16 of a 42-year dynasty, or is this kind of building towards a 2015 Notley scenario where you've got Sask United building some support, kind of carving off votes on the right, and then the NDP strong in urban centers. So I thought those were interesting by-elections for sure. Actually, quite a few interesting by-elections this summer in terms of political watchers who are not taking vacations and watching the online elections Canada returns or elections whatever province it is returns, and your live casts of America as well too. So as an aside there, anyways, in terms of the federal NDP. Yeah, I mean, I think the story is really about connecting to people who are struggling for them. I think Jagmeet Singh certainly has appeal to the downtown progressive NDP type of voter. I don't know if he's ever had that same type of connection to the type of NDP voter in Saskatchewan we were just talking about, or the BC interior, or Northern Ontario, or Windsor, the kind of more blue collar working class NDP. So I think building those connections there and showing that he understands what those people are going through is probably the biggest objective he's facing.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on the NDP in the fall?
Well, I don't disagree that they need to get their elbows up a little bit in terms of trying to define themselves. I think the way the issues present themselves, I think they can naturally probably pivot a bit and go after the Conservatives just in terms of sort of some of their solutions for housing or people affordability. There's clearly a good divide between a conservative approach to the versus the NDP. I think though the NDP have to be a bit concerned if this conservative lead continues and sort of solidifies at that 10-point gap, that you now run the risk of that strategic support and sort of those conversations about there's anxiety and heart palpitations start to go up amongst a certain population in this country whenever there's even a sniff of a conservative government, minority or majority. So there'll be starts of conversations about why am I supporting the NDP? Like what do I get out of this? What's better than potentially the Liberals, or in that conversation? Sure, maybe Jagmeet Singh can present themselves as sort of newer and fresher than a potentially sort of tired Liberal government, but I think that's going to be a bit of a struggle for them as they try to maintain kind of a purpose in the House.
All right, the Conservatives. It's going to be a fall with probably have some news on the Chinese election interference thing.
Right.
That will be an issue that'll come out over the next few months. Andrew, what do you think the Conservatives need to do over the fall?
Well, I think that obviously that committee and sort of that investigation will carry on. How much, like, I don't know if, I mean, I always thought that thing was gone months ago, and it seems to sort of reinvent itself and come back with some sort of revelation. So who knows what we get? I'm not sure it'll still have the same sort of star power. I think you'll see some interesting debate around the effort of the Liberal government to sort of reduce expenditures that suddenly sort of slid out there, as they're gonna, I think something like they're mandated, and Anita Anand has mandated departments to find a significant savings. So Conservatives will be sort of watching that to see where that goes. But I also like to see the Conservatives take the opportunity. Again, you've got a couple years to sort of hone out some of the policy areas that they speak to, and maybe get into areas like immigration, which I think is going to be a really important topic in this country over the next number of years. And I think there's from public opinion and the work that we do at Leger, that there's a bit of a disconnect from what the public thinks is required and what business community and governments feel is required. And I think there's opportunities for the Conservatives there. Environments we talked about. You can't pretend that it might not. You can't hope that it might not be an issue in 2 years. And so I think there's areas that they could work on as well, and use the next session to sort of do a bit of that, broaden their appeal.
Dan, what do you think on Conservatives in the fall?
Yeah, I think clearly they have some, as we talked about, some good targets to take shots at on the government. The carbon tax being one of them. Housing, I think Poilievre has been very good in terms of the videos he's put out when he's talking about the issue of housing. So I think those are good issues for them to keep pushing on. And ultimately, I think he needs to focus on things like that and not get pulled into this conspiracy theory vortex of what the base is screaming about, because that's when he kind of goes off kilter, I think, and does bring out that cognitive dissonance compared to what people are seeing in the ads there. So, if I was advising him, I would say, he doesn't have to be a puppy dog who's making puzzles every day. He can certainly attack the government. He can certainly show energy. He can show that opposition that you expect from an opposition leader. But I think I would tone down the nasty a little bit, because I think that turns some people off. And clearly that was what the ads were in response to. And I think he should stay focused on economic issues. And I think he'll be in good shape if he does that.
All right, and then for the Liberals, so they've had a bit of a rough year so far. The polls have shown that, but it's just been crisis after crisis, it seems, within the government. The cabinet shuffle didn't seem to change the narrative much. If anything, it worsened it. Andrew, why don't you go first? What if when we chat again at the end of the session in or sitting or whatever it is, I can't recall the correct term, but in December, what are we going to look back and say that was either a successful few months or a failure for the government?
Well, I think part of the challenge for the government in the past year was the inability to kind of get onto a consistent narrative that they wanted to talk about. The electoral interference just didn't go away, and it wasn't anything. It was a massive distraction, and became, obviously, it grew into a bigger problem. I think for the government, they're focused on trying to get back onto an economic message. I think success for them is the ability to start talking about that in a much more consistent and deliberate fashion. There's lots of talk about the housing and what role they can play. They've got a few ideas out there. I think they need to start to really sort of get that organized and create the sense that there's a real strong focus from the government in that area, in some manner, and try to stay, try to get onto that, and the economy. And it's not like the government isn't doing good things on the economy. I mean, they've worked well with some of the provincial premiers and sort of large investments and large manufacturing opportunities. But it's the consistency around that, and I think that's where, if they can get to that, I think it would be a start. It's a hard path, because as I talked about earlier, I mean, and as Dan mentioned, I mean, it still doesn't change the fact that they're in year 8 and going into year 9 and probably year 10 and a fourth election. Those are big, daunting things to try to convince the Canadians that you're still a government of lots of energy, enthusiasm, and new ideas.
Dan, what makes this a success or a failure over the next few months?
Well, I mean, the first strategic objective is to make it a success, is to keep this deal with the NDP together, I think, because I don't think the Liberals want an election right now. I think they need to get past this current economic pressure cooker I mentioned before they would want an election. So, if Jagmeet Singh wants dental care, pharmacare, or a national bicycle strategy, or whatever it is, I think they need to make sure he's happy and give him a call on his birthday and take him out to the movies and whatever it is to keep him happy. I think is probably the number one priority right now for the Liberals. Beyond that, I think in terms of the story they're trying to tell to voters, Andrew's right. It's gotten a bit waylaid because of foreign interference and other distractions. So yeah, I need to clear the decks of those distractions, and then I think just make sure that the Liberals are telling a coherent story about how they've got the backs of Canadians. I mean, this was the success of this government during COVID was, we're there for you, we got your back. Even during the Trump NAFTA era, it was, we're standing up to Trump, we're protecting our steel workers, we're there for you. And now that people are struggling financially, the government's not going to solve inflation. They're not going to be able to give everybody a new house and free gas and even cut the price of ground meat in half. They're not going to do anything like that, but they're at least going to have to try to find ways to leave people with the impression that they care, they understand what Canadians are going through, people are struggling, and that they're doing some stuff to help, and make sure they get that message so that it's heard, and people at least feel like the government is in their corner and paying attention to them. And that could be new policy. It could be just communicating the things that they're doing in a different way with different types of visuals and different types of events to kind of emphasize the things they've already done. But I think having a story that shows they've got the backs of Canadians is certainly the primary objective from a narrative perspective.
Well, there'll be a number of things to watch over the fall. It's always an interesting political season. We have that Manitoba election, and maybe we can get together again in October and talk about what happened there and what it might mean for elections elsewhere in the country. So I hope you both have a good rest of the summer, and we'll talk again soon.
Excellent. Likewise to you guys. Have a good,
Thanks.
good rest of the summer. Thanks, Eric.